Codename Kids Next Door Operation Video Game. Play as your favorite operative, collect cool weapons, and take on villains like Nightbrace and the Toilet Hater. Look for the Codename Kids Next Door Operation Video Game in stores. Rated everyone 10 and up.
One of Cartoon Network's biggest shows during the 2000s was Codename Kids Next Door, created by Thomas Warburton, better known as Mr. Warburton, and released in 2002. The series was about an organization of kids that would fight against adult tyranny inside their massive tree houses while using their 2x4 technology made with rubber bands, styrofoam cups, and chewed up bubblegum. Our main characters, numbers 1 through 5, reside in the Sector V treehouse. They fight against villains based on general fears or distaste of children. Nightbrace is a dentist that tries to forcefully brush kids' teeth using cruel methods. Count Spankula is a vampire that breaks into people's houses and spanks naughty children. Grandma Stuff'em, who wants to force-feed children until they're too fat to cause trouble, and has probably caused the most real-world damage, as kids would watch an episode featuring her and their wires would cross at the wrong time, thus turning them into chubby chasers for life. Oh, trust me, there are probably dozens of cartoons throughout history that have unintentionally caused people to develop strange kinks. What have you done to me? But what made KND stand out? I think it's the creativity. You would think that making an action cartoon that uses kids as a theme wouldn't lead to many options. Kids aren't a very specific theme after all, they're a demographic, but they did a lot with it. And they were pretty clever with the ideas they had. One example I can think of is the Six Scum Gang, more specifically their guns. Now, in most cartoons you can't use realistic guns, so they replaced them with lasers instead, but here they use chewed up bubblegum. That doesn't sound too interesting on its own until you really think about it. Two cliches within Western films are the sharpshooter and when the main character spits out chewing tobacco as it hits something in the distance to show how good they are at aiming. Now imagine we mix both of these cliches together and have them spit their tobacco into the gun as ammo, but since this is a kids show, we replace it with chewed up bubblegum. This is what I mean by the show being creative. It managed to mix two cliches together and change it enough to still work within its universe and theme. Sure, sometimes they'll do a basic idea like bullies being portrayed as dinosaurs, but for every easy idea, there's a clever one right around the corner. And that's all you really need for kids, something to get their imagination going. Why do you think so many kids love Pokemon or Ben 10? It's enough to get their minds rolling with ideas as what could exist in this universe. I'd love to talk about the show more, but it's time we get to the real topic at hand. Kids Next Door, Operation Video Game.
Let's see what you think of this!
Number 86 sends them a message informing them that several villains have escaped the prison in the Arctic base, and it's up to number 1 and his team to recapture them and send them to the moon base. To be honest, the story is the worst part of the game for me. It's just so basic. I'm not expecting anything groundbreaking for a licensed game, but it's just so by the books. Personally, what I would have done is made the game like titles such as Rugrats Search for Reptar, or Fairly Odd Parents Breaking the Rules. Using the Sector V treehouse as a hub, you go to different objects that will act as a mission. The more missions you complete, the more the treehouse opens up. This would mean that every level can be treated as its own story, perhaps taking inspiration from specific episodes, while leading towards a bigger confrontation. Instead, you go through each level as different operatives, as they must hunt down every villain that has escaped. For platforming stages, you play as operatives number 1, 3, 4, and 5. One thing I do like is how none of the operatives play the exact same. Number 1 only uses ranged weapons and has a grappling shot. Number 3 can glide in the air, number 4 is exclusively a physical fighter, and number 5 can double jump and wall jump. But what about number 2? Well, you don't play as him in any platforming stages, but you do play as him in these shoot-em-up stages while flying the cool bus, flying around, shooting enemies, and using your shield to absorb projectiles, and using that energy to perform a screen wipe, which, I'll admit, is pretty satisfying to do. Of course, you have things to collect throughout each level. The first are 2x4 technology pieces, used to unlock new weaponry that can be used to make that level easier. Most of the time, the weapon in question is not required to beat the stage, but you'll want to find them anyway as they make certain challenges less obnoxious. For example, in the level Spankerific, you start off with a Gumzooka, which is fine, but if you really want to beat these spank-happy vampires, then you'll get the pieces needed to get the Scamp. It's a lot more powerful, and the charge shot is almost always guaranteed to take down enemies in one go. Hey look, they even do that thing in the show where the computer describes the weapon and what the abbreviation means.
Kids Next Door Scam, Soup Can, and Magnified Photon Phaser.
The other collectible is Rainbow Monkeys, also very round and super chunky. Brain love wherever they go. Everyone's made of a big rainbow. All red and orange and pink and blue. Rainbow Monkeys, we love you! Seriously, why did Cartoon Network never capitalize on these things? You would think they would have made real Rainbow Monkey plushies, but they never did. Instead, we got trading cards that don't even use original art, and instead use screenshots from the show. They didn't even make trading cards based on the in-show trading card game, Yipper cards. That's the stuff that kids like. They want to play with the same toys and games shown off in their shows, like Sumo Slammers from Ben 10 or Crimson Chin from Fairly Odd Parents. You can't tell me that making stuffed animals would have been hard or expensive, especially since they could have easily made a collaboration with Build-A-Bear Workshop. Unless they were Ben 10 or Powerpuff Girls, most Cartoon Network shows got the short end of the stick when it came to merchandise opportunities and toy lines. Oh no, we couldn't think of any ideas of merch for Kids Next Door. A show filled with characters and villains that would make great action figures, 2x4 technology that could work as Nerf guns or foam bats for kids to knock their block off with, Yipper trading cards, and Rainbow Monkeys that would be the easiest and probably lucrative to produce. No, instead you'll get some figures, trading cards that use screenshots from the show, and vending machine small figures that aren't even scaled properly with the other characters. Seriously, why is number 2 half the size of number 3? But hey, at least they're here in the game. Collecting enough in each stage unlocks content within the top secret page. This is where you can unlock cheats, concept art, and yes, images of those same trading cards, and a video explaining how the card game works. There's other stuff in this page worth checking out, but I'll go over that later. I actually have a quick story before we continue. Earlier I mentioned the level Spankerific. I never beat this game, not because it was hard by all means. There were some moments that gave me some difficulties as a child, but nothing too difficult. You see, while I was playing the game, my mom called me as we were going somewhere. Without thinking, I turned off the PlayStation 2. Usually they give you a warning not to do this if you're saving, so I thought that turning the game off while it was loading would be fine, but the next time I played the game, it had told me that the save was corrupted. As an impatient kid, I didn't feel like playing through all that again, so I turned off the console and hadn't played the game again until almost 20 years later. It was an important lesson to me not just shut off a console carelessly, a lesson I'll surely never forget. But that's pretty much all there is. Fight enemies, occasional platforming, fighting a boss, a shoot 'em up stage, yada yada yada. That's the problem with the game. It's your typical licensed game of the era, 3D action game starring famous character. The best way to describe these games would be V.I.D.E.O.G.A.M.E. the game, starring a licensed character. Just run from point A to point B, occasionally fighting enemies, and performing basic platforming challenges. Rarely ever changing the gameplay, minus the cliches you've seen 1,000 times before, such as your obligatory stealth level, going around flipping switches, or navigating through a maze. And because of that, there really isn't that much to talk about. Father's in the game, and he's treated as the main villain pulling the strings, but you never fight him. Same goes for Kree, who also plays an important role in the story. Oh yeah! The tutorial stage isn't the only time you face off against the Toilinator, as later in the game he comes back with his own henchmen. There are toilet paper mummies, which are pretty alright in design, but the minion I wanted to talk about is the Behemoth. Yes, there is an entire enemy in the game that's just walking feces, and he only appears in this one room. I didn't even know this was allowed. What a shithead. No, seriously, he has dreadlocks made of turds. This guy's literally a shithead, and he walks around like he owns the damn place. Honestly, would you stop him? If this thing walked into my house, I would just leave. It's his house now, and I'd be trespassing at that point. I'm a lot of things, but I'm not a criminal, and I'm not dealing with this shit. Now, I could milk the fact that this is just an okay game until the video is long enough to get more ads like most YouTubers do. Because apparently if something is just okay, we've got to constantly reiterate how okay it is for 10 minutes or more, resulting in the same video becoming just as okay, if not worse than the product they were dunking on, followed by some weird sponsorship that has nothing to do with the channel's theme. Speaking of which, Raid Shadow Legends! Huh? Gotcha, didn't I? I might not have a brain, but I have this thing called a soul. Instead, I'll use this as an opportunity to do something a little different. Even though this is just a typical license game from the era, there were some things that did surprise me, and some things that were worth some praise. So, here are the top 5 things that surprised me about Kids Next Door Operation Video Game. Number 5. I already mentioned how each character slightly plays differently. Now that's pretty standard, but what I really like is how every character is expressive. Each operative has their own unique animations that show off their personality. Even just climbing up a ledge is different, from number 4 being more aggressive, and number 3 doing a twirl. Speaking of number 3, she's probably the character that has the most visual personality in the game. Her idle animation has her dancing in place, and her walking animation has her hands up in excitement. It's all so cute, but if you saw this running at you in the middle of the night, you'd probably be terrified.
Come here, you little hamsters. Let me love you. Let me love you.
Number 4. This one features some spoilers. Spoilers for nearly 20-year-old licensed games, but spoilers nonetheless.
Did you know? It was never real to begin with.
The final boss of the game has the main villains fused together to form the Amalgamation, a kaiju-sized hybrid of Count Spankulot, Nightbrace, Stickybeard, Common Cold, Grandma Stuff'em, and the Toilinator. To fend off this monstrous hybrid, you control the moon base, which has now become a giant mech. That is actually really cool. For one, they never did this in the show, so it's completely unexpected. And 2, you can't tell me that kids didn't love this. Kids love mindless destruction and seeing giant robots fight against massive monsters. I mean, really? Who doesn't? Minus those pretentious prudes that think that everything has to be deep to be considered good. This is a great final fight, and it wasn't a cakewalk either. Number 3. These type of games will try to hold your hand, often stopping the action to slowly pan the camera over to the next objective. And yes, this game is guilty of that too. But when it's not doing that, it feels like it's teaching kids the basics of video games. What do I mean by that? Well, there's a super move in the game. Once this meter is filled, you can press a button to activate the super attack that hits everything around you. There are times when enemies will spawn in all directions. If you try to attack them normally, you're bound to get hit. But if you use your super, you'll push them away. To most adults and experienced players, they'll know exactly what to do. Kids might have a harder time, but they'll learn this lesson without the game needing to stop to tell them directly, teaching them to recognize enemy patterns to know what the best course of action is. Another example would be the cool bus stages. Sometimes you'll be bombarded by enemies. This might look like bad design, but remember, you have a shield that absorbs your enemy shots that fuels a screen wipe. When these projectiles are coming in all directions and there are too many guys to count, a kid may learn to utilize their other tools rather than just pressing one button. This game made me realize that this is what licensed games should have done. Help kids learn the basics of video games without completely holding their hand, using famous characters to introduce them to a new medium they might love. And with the lessons they learned, they can tackle original IPs like Ratchet & Clank or Sly Cooper. Number 2. Remember that top secret section I mentioned earlier? One really cool thing about it is that you can actually play as any enemy and boss through this page. There are simulation rooms that let you take full control of any enemy you've encountered, moving around and testing their abilities. That's really cool. Not only does this give you an idea as to how these enemies work, but it can also give some tips on game development and designing enemies and bosses. Some things I learned throughout the simulation is that the vampire wannabe shoots bats out of his urethra. Gross. Using Stickybeard's X attack allowed me to find out that if you die as an enemy, it just switches you to the next despite them not actually dying. Enemies will perform their dying animation, but they'll just get right back up. Maybe it's a glitch or even a safe precaution done in case an enemy really does die in that room for whatever reason. I don't know. And lastly, number 1. And this brings us to the Wolf Code with Velvet. It's cool that you get to play as any enemy in this simulation room, but wouldn't it be cooler to control them in the main game? Well, I got good news for you. Once you beat the game and get 40 rainbow monkeys on the credit stage, you unlock Possession Mode. Now go into any level and lock onto an enemy and press the right button and they'll be under your control. The only difference here is that you can actually give and receive damage from enemies. If you die as an enemy, you'll return unharmed. The only downside is that you can't perform important objectives, such as saving these kids from the spank-happy vampires, but you can easily leave and kill the enemy by holding the right button. While this game is pretty standard in execution, it did some things that surprised me, things that I think do deserve some praise. It may not be the best licensed game, nor the worst, but I think it's worth looking into for some of the things it does right.